thank you all for joining the CTDL proposals and task group planning webinar today. As I mentioned, we do have a packed agenda that we will be going over. And as always, this session is being recorded and will be made available to everyone following today's call. I am Scarlett Jekyll, the Accounts and Publishing Manager for Credential Engine, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Jeannie Kitchens, Stuart Sutton, Nate Argo, and Phil Barker. And I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Jeannie.
Great, thank you, Scarlett. And we do have a lot to cover today, but we definitely welcome your questions and comments throughout the webinar in the chat. And feel free to raise your hand if you want to speak, and we can pause and answer questions as well throughout the webinar. Today we're going to talk about two Credential Transparency Description Language, or CTDL, proposals that we're moving forward. And the first one will be the Scheduling Patterns for Learning Opportunities, presented by Phil Barker. The second will be Credential Approval Lists, presented by myself and Nate Argo. And then we're going to fill you in on a new CTDL task group that is being formed, and Stuart will provide a little background on that, and we'll welcome you at the end of this webinar to join that if you're interested. And then we'll talk about next steps and where we are with these proposals and how you can provide feedback. So with the Credential Transparency Description Language, we do have a design process. The CTDL is a living language. Think of it as a dictionary. Think of it as a large dictionary for describing, making rich descriptions about credentials and many other things adjacent to credentials. And so we do follow policies. Those policies are available for anyone to see on our website. And when we need to bring in subject matter experts, we create what are called task groups. And those task groups are temporary. And one of the proposals that we'll see today specifically came from a task group called where is it on here? It is not on here. It's the Credential Approval List task group. We'll have to correct that slide and add one more. But anyhow, in this last box, you can get the picture of the various task groups going back the last few years. There's been others before this, but it gives you an idea of the kind of task groups that we have stood up to expand the CTDL. And just a little background on these two proposals. When we move forward a CTDL proposal, a lot of thought, a lot of meetings and input has gone into the process. And we're at rather a tail end of these processes, but it still is a chance for you to provide feedback. So with this Learning Opportunity Scheduling Patterns proposal that Phil will go over, this actually stemmed from a proposal that was largely implemented with the CTDL that expanded CTDL terms in particular for learning programs and courses. But when we presented this, the early concepts for scheduling patterns, they didn't quite hit the mark. And so we continued to work on it. And what you're going to see today is what came of that feedback and that work that has been presented multiple times now, even prior to the December tag meetings that you see here on the slide. And today, this is the stakeholder webinar. So it's the last kind of big information sharing session that we have in the process. And for the Credential Approval List, you can see that we completed a task group in January of this year. So this was just completed work, and we've presented it to our technical advisory group multiple times. And now, of course, we're presenting it to all of you today. So let's go ahead and talk about the Schedule Patterns for Learning Opportunities proposal. And Phil, would you like me to cover this slide, or would you like to go ahead and take it from here?
I'll pick up from here if that's okay.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you for the introduction, Jeannie. CTDL has covered learning opportunities for a long time. I think from, well, for as long as I've been involved in it, certainly. And the reason for that is quite obvious, I guess, that many learning opportunities lead to credentials, and there's not a great deal of point in telling somebody that a credential is available unless you also tell them how they can earn that credential. So oftentimes that means telling them about the learning opportunity that they can enroll on in order to earn the credential. Recently, as Jeannie mentioned, we've broken down learning opportunity profiles into courses and learning programs. Essentially, the difference is that a learning program will often be comprised of several different courses. Courses might have smaller subparts, but we don't go down to that level of detail. We have a lot of properties that can describe courses, learning programs, and learning opportunities. But as Jeannie mentioned, one of the things that we want to add to that is information about scheduling. So if we can move on to the next slide. It's not often enough just for somebody to know that a learning opportunity exists in order for them to know whether they can take it. They'll often be constrained by factors such as when they are available. It might be, if somebody has a job, maybe they're only available in the evenings or at weekends. Alternatively, they might be working at evenings and weekends and only available during the day. So there's a certain amount of information about the actual scheduling pattern when a course is available that is required before somebody can make a sensible decision about whether that learning opportunity is right for them. And when I say learning opportunity, I mean not just what the CTDL class of learning opportunity, but also the new classes that we call programs and courses, and also including that are the assessments, because it's also important to know whether you're likely to be available at the time when an assessment is offered. What I want to make clear that we're not getting into here is the level of detail that's required for actually putting something into a calendar. We're not going to be talking about what time a particular course is offered on which evenings. That's beyond the scope of what we can usefully offer through the registry, or because it would require updating far too often. There are ways of describing that using schema.org's description language, and those are compatible with CTDL. So if anybody's using CTDL outside of the registry, then there are terms available to them they can use for the detailed calendaring aspects of scheduling. What we're interested in here is simply the broad brushstroke picture of what sort of times are you likely to need to turn up for a course. Next slide. Here you see the information, the data model for the relevant part of CTDL, and you see just some of the properties that are available for describing learning opportunities. And we're adding just a few to these. Primarily what we're adding are 3 properties relating to the scheduling of courses. The first of which is the offer frequency. This is to tell somebody how frequently a course or other learning opportunity is offered. Is it offered once a year? Is it something that's offered once a month? In other words, if they want to enroll on this course, how long are they likely to have to wait between different offerings? The second property that's we're adding is the schedule frequency type. And this is to tell somebody, once they're enrolled on a learning opportunity, how often are they likely to need to turn up? Are they going to have to turn up once a week? Are they going to have to turn up daily? Is it perhaps just a one-off opportunity, so they only have to turn up once? And then the third is the timing. This is the one that tells you whether you're likely to have to turn up in the evening, during the day, or weekends. So these 3 properties are available for any type of learning opportunity or assessment, and they each link via an alignment object to a to one of two concept schemes. One to tell you the frequency, so that's the one that will tell you whether a course is offered annually or monthly, or whether you'll have to turn up for the course daily or weekly, and another one for timing. So that's the one that will tell you whether the course is offered in the evenings, during the day, or at weekends. The feedback that Jeannie mentioned earlier, that's important to the latest refinement to this model, is that sometimes a course is offered in more than one place, and it might be offered in one place as in the evenings, and another place during the day. And so we need a way of gathering together the frequency and the information about each offering into a single unit, so that we're not just saying that it's available evenings, weekends, daytimes, and good luck figuring out what information pertains to what. We also got feedback that some things like the cost or the mode through which the course is offered might vary with place and with the scheduling. So a part-time course might cost more or might cost less than a full-time course. Likewise, the outcomes, the aggregate outcomes for students might vary depending on the location or on the scheduling. You know, it might be that people who take the course during the evening have different earning profiles from the people who take the course during the day. So in order to gather all of this information up, we created an object called schedule offering, which can be described in much the same way as any of the things that can be scheduled are, and which you can also talk about the frequency. So to connect a course, for example, to a scheduled offering, we have a property has offering. Hopefully the next slide will show how these work. The next two slides are diagrams of what instance data would look like, the triple diagram similar to what we put into our handbook. So yes, move on to the next slide, please. So here's a simple case. This is a course on data analysis with Python that's offered at one location. It's offered at the main campus of Sunnydale University. And the offer frequency type tells you that this is offered annually. This course occurs once a year. The schedule and frequency type tells you that it's scheduled weekly. And the timing type tells you that it happens during the day. So that's a fairly straightforward, quite conventional type of course. If we move on to the next, we see the sort of additional information that you can provide when the course is offered in two different places. So we have the same course, but this time there are two scheduled offerings of it. The first one at the top, and I do apologize that the text is probably too small for you to see. The first one at the top is offered annually. No, sorry. I'm struggling myself because I can't read the text on this. The first offering at the top is offered in Moon Valley. It takes place weekly and it's scheduled during the evenings. The second offering at the bottom is offered at Sunnydale at the main campus, and this is the one that takes place weekly and during the day. So you have these two offerings, and it will be possible to associate different costs with the two offerings. It will be possible to say that the outcomes, you know, the aggregate data for students is different for the two offerings. So the next slide is what we're going to be doing next. We invite everybody to look at the fund proposal. I described this in detail during a meeting of the technical advisory group in December, so feel free to have a look at the recording of that. There's a Google Doc that you can look at. There are details in GitHub that include sample data, for example, and let us know what you think. By all means, let us know if you think that this is it, that this does the job for you. But if you are thinking of supplying data that can't be modeled in this way, or if you have a use case that requires data that can't be modeled in this way, then I guess this is getting on for your last opportunity to tell us that you have additional requirements, in which case we go back and see what we can do to meet those additional requirements. Assuming all is well, we'll add these terms to CTDL as unstable until we know that they work. And we'll be drafting a section for the CTDL handbook. So that's it from me. I don't know if we have time for any questions now, but I'd be happy to take any if we do.
If anyone has any questions for Phil, let us know. Phil, I'm just gonna quickly click on this Google document. Scarlett also put it in the chat. And it really does provide a readable explanation in more detail, basically backing up everything Phil just said. So we certainly encourage you to take a look at it, read through it, and use any of the ways to either respond and let us know this is perfect, or hey, what about this? Here's some, provide some feedback. So you'll see there's a table of contents here. And the document is structured to indicate, what the changes, as Phil was explaining, some of the use case examples, the scheduling patterns, along with diagrams and examples. So it's very thorough, and we welcome you to take a look at his setup so you can comment on this document. And see, do we have anything in the chat? No?
Anything in the chat?
Okay. Well, if we don't have any questions on the scheduling proposal, we're going to go ahead and move on to the final draft credential approvals list, CTDL domain model and terms proposal. That is quite a mouthful, isn't it? As I had mentioned earlier in this webinar, a task group was formed. It was a rather large task group. Scarlett, I want to say we had around 100 people possibly in this task group, and they were subject matter experts, people who either create credential lists or have as a stakeholder in this talent ecosystem, have a very strong interest in this work. And we followed a process. And you can see here the list of the things that we covered in that meeting. And what I'm going, and I myself and Nate Argo will go over, is a proposal that gathers up all of the feedback, research, and basically final documentation that came out of this task group. And before we get into it, though, I want to make sure everybody understands what is meant by credential approval lists. There are many organizations, including governments, state governments, for example, that create lists for various reasons that are intended to communicate something very specific in the context of that list. One very commonly known example is an eligible training provider list that gets created by states in line with the WIOA Act. And there's many other kinds of lists. There's organizations that create lists of quality credentials, and these are credentials that meet their criteria for quality. Industry recognized credential lists, GI Bill lists, and many more. And we have some more examples in our documentation as well. But when I say credential, I really mean it as a handle for all types of credentials. A credential could be a badge. It could be a certificate of completion. It could be a diploma. It could be any type of degree. So any type of credential, as well as related learning opportunities, such as programs and courses and assessments. We use Credential Approval Lists as a handle because if I had to say all of that every time, it would be a really long sentence. So that's what we mean by Credential Approval Lists. It could be a list of courses, it could be a list of learning programs, or any combination of these things. And we really focused on the list owner use cases. So we really focused on the organizations that are responsible for creating these type of lists and making sure that the solution works for them to the benefit of many other actors that can then utilize this data, such as students. So that's how we went about it. And just so to make sure everyone is aware, as we pointed out with Phil's presentation, we can already describe courses and learning programs and learning opportunities. Well, we can also describe all kinds of rich information about credentials and assessments as well. So many list owners are already doing that. They're publishing data to the registry that are learning opportunities or credentials or assessments. But that's happening without the context of a list. So now we're going to be able to say, and for any kind of data consumers to know, okay, this learning opportunity is on this list. So that's what's already supported, and that's what we want to enable. And what we want to enable is the leveraging of linking of data. The CTDL is a link data specification. And we want credential list owners, such as states, that will be able to see crossover of credentials on multiple lists and benefit from reducing the overhead of maintaining data locally. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this document. And we're just going to kind of walk through sections of it. This document is available for all of you to review and to add your comments. It does accept comments. You can see it has a table of contents here. And we start off with a change log, and you can see that we've already made changes to this based on feedback. One of the things that I did not list on the slide, but we have also done, is we have held interviews with several, in particular states, that are responsible for creating lists and making lists data available to their communities and students and workers and employers and so forth. And so we've made changes based on their feedback. And I already went over the introduction. You'll recognize some of the text that I literally pulled from this document. So I'm just going to kind of go down past the review process area here. This is where we are presenting at this meeting. You could see, what was involved in the process to date. The Credential Engine CTDL team, our names are all here, so you can know who worked on this. Let's come on down to the use cases. So for our use cases, we gathered a lot of use cases. And we can share the link to the documentation on the use cases that were scoped in the task group charter. But we really wanted to focus here on the key or primary use cases for list owners, because we do have use cases for other actors, as I mentioned. But for those other actors to benefit from the data, well, they have to get it from the owner or the creator of a list that provides that data. So we really wanted to focus on the list owner use cases and making sure that list owners and including the many state partners that we have could utilize the CTDL solution. And I want to point out a couple of important, well, they're all important use cases, but a couple that are really helpful to understand this proposal. And that kind of ranges from number 4 here. As a list owner, I need to add credentials to my list that I own or offer. So I could be that I'm a college, but I'm going to create a special list of credentials or learning opportunities for some specific reason. Maybe I'm part of a special program being offered, and I want to identify those in a specific list. But you can see we also want to be able to come down here. I'm going to jump down to number 7, because these use cases are all building off each other. And we want to be able to get to list owners that need to add credentials to a list that they do not own or offer. And so I've already pointed out that many states already do this. You know, many organizations that make it as a part of their mission or a part of what they do create these lists, but they're creating lists that they're not credentials or learning opportunities they offer, others offer those. And they want to be able to describe the members of the list with information that's pertinent to that list. But they also want to be able to point out to the credential as it's described by the owner. So it's not a duplication of information. The context of a list is based on the information that list needs to have, but whenever possible, it's helpful and reduces the kind of management of that data when you can also just point out to the actual credential as described by the offerer. So those are the primary use cases. And to do that, I'm going to click on another link here. We like to do a lot of models and pictures of how our solutions work. And this is the final model. This is after several iterations with our task group. And it's okay if you can't read every bit of this. The main thing I want to communicate here is that in this model, everything that you see that is black text with a white background already exists in the CTDL. So there's already a lot that the CTDL covers. And often when we need to make an enhancement to the CTDL, a little bit goes a long, long way. And so therefore, only the things in orange here are newly introduced in this proposal. And that is to take the things that I've already mentioned, whether it's a credential or say a course or an assessment, and put it in the context of a list. And so I'm just going to quickly walk through the important parts of this picture to explain it, where I have, say, an organization like a state agency that wants to create a list. Well, at Credential Engine, the CTDL, we already have a mechanism to do this. It's called a collection. So the collection is a place where you can put all the members, the collection members of your list. And we also need to be able to identify what this collection or list consists of. And so over here in orange, what we want to do is have a way to say, for example, this state agency has a collection or a list of learning opportunities and credentials. And we need to know that the context of that is that it's an eligible training provider list. And again, I like to use that example because most people are familiar with the TPLs, but you can see that's not the only type of list. And in our proposal, I believe we have additional types of lists that have come up as well, but you can see them here on some here on the left. And what we need to be able to do is allow a way for the list owner that may not offer the credential to describe these things. And whenever possible, point out to the version of that or the credential as it is described by the owner of it. So what I'm going to do is jump back to this document, and we're going to show another diagram that gets a little more into, I'm going to click here, and I think this is a little better explanatory picture, similar to the pictures that you just saw Phil talk about. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Nate Argo, to walk us through this. Nate?
Okay.
Thank you.
So what we see here is in the top left, we'll start over there, is the organization object. And that's the organization in this case that owns the collection. And throughout this example, it's a state ETPL. And so we have the state agency in the upper left. It owns the collection, which is that blue circle there in kind of the center left. You can see the connections down in the bottom left to the concepts for lifecycle status type and collection type, indicating that this is an active collection that is an ETPL specifically. Those are the things Jeannie just went over a moment ago. And then off to the right here, we have 4 connections, 4 of these has member arrows pointing out to things in the registry. And so these are here to describe, to demonstrate 4 different kind of use cases that we have for the types of members of a collection. Now down at the bottom here, we can see that the green box is the data that's in the graph for the collection. The blue box is what we call secondary source data. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then the orange box is primary source data. So primary source data you're probably already familiar with is just anything that is in the registry comes from the owner of the information. Essentially, they're just records in the registry as they've been up to this point. And we'll go into secondary source data in a moment. So the first use case here, the simplest one, is the collection has a member that is just a credential in the registry. This is the simplest use case. It's kind of the ideal use case where the credential fully describes everything that it needs to describe in order to be useful to users of that collection. The second has member arrow there points to a collection member object, and the purpose of the collection member object is to indicate the start date and the end date of that item's membership on the collection. And this is for use cases where, again, for the state ETPL example, each credential, each course, each whatever in that collection may have a unique start date and end date for its inclusion in that list. So here, the rest of it is the same. So it's, again, just pointing out to a credential that's in the registry via the proxy4 property. And that allows the collection member, or the owner of the collection, to say, this thing is on my collection from this date until this date. The next 2 cases deal with the secondary source data. So just to summarize that real quick, secondary source data is a means for someone who is not the intellectual property owner of the credential or of the course of the, whatever, to publish data about it in the registry. This is different from something like third-party publishing, where it's still coming from the actual source of the data. It's just being published on their behalf by someone, by another agency who, is maybe a bit more technically savvy or whatever. For secondary source data, it's actually coming from a different source. And Credential Engine will, of course, still be in control of who is allowed to publish those kinds of records. So for instance, the state agency here both publishes the collection and this credential data. And there are a couple of reasons you might want to do this, and there are these last 2 use cases here. So the first reason, or the first one we've got on the example here, shows the secondary source data filling in some gaps in the primary source data. So for instance, the state wanted to assert that not only does this credential have the things that it says about itself over in the primary source record, but we also want to indicate that this is it has an industry type of manufacturing, has a jurisdiction of Indiana, has whatever other properties of credential they want to make additional assertions about. And then because there is a primary source record in the registry to point to, the publisher of the secondary source record can reference that via the same as connection. So the way that this would work if you were consuming the data is you would first get the collection, you would get the collection members, you would follow that out to the secondary source credential, you would consume that data, you would say, oh, there's a same as connection to another credential record, let me go and look at this. You would pull in that primary source record, and at that point, you as the consumer of the data have both the secondary and primary source records for that credential. So you have all of the information kind of at your fingertips to pick and choose from. The bottom item here is, again, using a secondary source record, but the difference here is that there is no primary source record in that last use case. So there's the maybe the educational institution or what have you has not published anything to the registry. So it's in essence up to the state in that case to publish the data about the credential or about the course, the assessment, and so on. So you can see the secondary source record in that case contains all of the data that the state wants to assert about that credential.
Thank you, Nate. It always helps to go through a picture to explain these kind of, sometimes complex solutions of data solutions. And what I'm going to do is click on the terms proposal. So the picture that I showed you, the model that I showed you, and explained that the CTDL often needs a very small number of updates that can then enable something completely new. And this is one of those cases where the vast majority of CTDL terms that we need to enable this benefit to states and others, we were talking a lot about states, but this is applicable to many types of organizations, is really just a few CTDL terms. And this is a proposal that lists them out. And so the way this works is we identify the new CTDL term, and you can see this table as a orange kind of color here to correspond to the picture of the model that I just showed you. And it's only going to identify the new terms. And you can comment in here on the definitions, and we will log and review all of the comments. So you could see that the terms proposal, you know, has a small number of terms, including the types of lists, which is really important. We did get some additional feedback on other types of lists that we need to include. State Promise Scholarship, for example, came up. If you're aware of other types of lists that we need to identify, then we could go ahead and add those. But keep in mind that CTDL is a living language as well. So if we did need to add additional types of lists, we would have the capability to do that. That wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, and
so
just if I could, I would also point out that you're also not limited to those terms that are in CTDL as far as the type of list goes. You could publish your own concept scheme with your own very specific list types if you needed to.
Thank you, Nate. So along with that small proposal of terms there that is numbered, we also include our registry, the Credential Registry minimum data policy. And because it's a small number of terms, it's a small change to the policy, and that identifies what would have to be required to be included for this type of a collection, and what would need to be included if you were going to identify collection members, and what would be a benchmark and what would be optional. And each one of those are defined in policy, where required means that if you're going to publish to the registry, you have to include that information. And a recommended benchmark is whenever you have that data available, it adds, you know, a lot more meaning and value to the information, whether it's to a student or, you know, a consuming application, to include additional information. So the terms proposal is pretty straightforward. The rest of it is links to all of the existing boxes that you saw in the diagram that I said, if it's black and white, it already exists. So if you're really curious and you want to learn more about them, you could look at them here and you can follow the links, and you could see all the CTDL terms that are already supported for creating lists in what we call collections. So that's the terms proposal. And one of the things that we do, and before I get down there and talk about some data examples, is the cross-state linking or cross-border linking of credential use cases is really important. It was really important to the task group that worked on this. And so not only is it about creating, you know, being able to create the list and describe things that a list owner does not own or offer, but to also consider things like reciprocity of things on a list across borders was another important use case that's described here. There's another diagram below that that gets into, it's really just a different way of looking at the diagram that Nate just went over. And actually, Nate, just let me just go ahead and click on that and just do a quick kind of walkthrough of this image.
Okay. So once again, we've got the organizations in the gray box on the left here. We've got our primary source data column in the orange and secondary source data in blue. So you can see the first 5 items in the primary source data are collections, and then you have a course at the very bottom. So if we just go through these one by one, the first one shows, you know, State 1 owns State 1's EPPL collection, which has a member, which is a course, and that course data is according to State 1. So that's one of those cases where the state one has published a secondary source record about that course. You can see that course has the red dotted arrow down pointing to the course that is the primary source data that's coming from the training institution. So again, if there is a primary source record and you want to point to that, you have that option. State 2 is doing the same thing as is State 3, but the interactions here are a little bit different here. So State 2 is saying that their course data only should be consumed, only should be paid attention to if you're consuming it in the context of their collection, which essentially means there's something about it being in that collection that makes that record kind of special, right? So maybe they've indicated, this course has this specific set of locations or costs or something to that effect, something that's unique to that course in the context of that collection. State 3 has published their course data as a secondary source record. And you can see State 4 has done something a little bit different here. State 4, rather than publishing their own record, is pointing to State 3's record about the course. And that's kind of the reciprocity thing Jeannie was talking about earlier, where maybe State 3 has a bunch of data, they've already published it. State 4 says, yep, looks good to us. Let's just point to your record, put your record in our collection too. And that's how that one is set up. State 5 has decided that they don't need any secondary source data. They're happy with the record that is in the registry that comes directly from the training institution. And so they're just pointing to it directly. And then you can see the blue dotted arrow, which again are optional connections between the secondary source records here to indicate that not only are these the same as the primary source course, but they are the same as each other. And again, that's totally optional.
Yeah, and all the ability to make all of these linking, we're just talking about linking here. We're not merging data together. We're literally linking it together. And that's really important because it also will help eventually get a much better handle with this example we keep using of an ATPL, but again, it could be many other types of lists where you want to know, for example, a specific credential, and you want to know, well, what lists, which ETPLs have this, for example, CompTIA credential. So it'll be very helpful to know, oh, it's in, all 50 states, or it's in 10 of the 50, and to know what they are. So be able to link all of that together in effective ways to communicate that information to those who need that information, that ranges from the credential, offers who may not even be aware that these things are occurring, and the range of students, workers, employers, the list owners, and so forth. Okay, so you can see we get into a lot of detail, we get into a lot of modeling and pictures and use cases and real world examples. And because we have this linked here, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this in this webinar, because this is really, now we're really getting into the code. And if you don't want to talk about, angle brackets and so forth, that's okay. But I do want you to know is that it's a very important step in the process is to have real world data. And so we have access to that. And because we're already working with many creators of lists, we already have a lot of data that we could utilize. And basically this link provides examples using the CTDL as linked data. And it's to further prove out the model. And it walks through the series of use cases. And you can see it's explained at the top of the page here, and each of the examples are explained. So if you are of the volition that you want to look at the code, we welcome you to do it. If you don't, that's fine. What I just need you to know is the kind of thought and work that goes into these proposals to make sure we're moving forward with absolutely the best possible proposal. And so because in this particular case, publishing to the registry is so integral in the development of this proposal, I had mentioned that we've also met with several states in particular that are already publishing data and would begin to use the proposal that we have here. So we also work through workflow type processes. How do they actually do it? What do they change? And the really good news for our partners who have joined today that are with some of those kinds of agencies and organizations that are already publishing to the registry, it really doesn't change what you're doing in terms of being able to publish the data to the registry that you have now. We're just going to now be able to do that in the context of a list, and in particular, in CTDL terms, the collection. So we do get into some information down here about that as well that is of interest to those who are publishing. And that is the last section of the proposal. Although I should point out there, for those of you who really want to get into the details, there are numerous links here that back up all of the work, all of the thought that came from this task group and into this final draft proposal. And let me go back here. And let me see if anybody has any questions or comments about the Credential Approval Lists CTDL proposal.
If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat.
And while folks are thinking about that, we do provide, the links to all of this information. You can feel free to review the draft and give us feedback. There's a number of different ways that we offer to provide that feedback that range from, for those of you who are technical and want to use our GitHub issue, to those of you who just want to read a Google document and add a comment, or send us an email. All those options are available to you. For those who really want to dig into the details, you can follow these links and get a really good sense of the plan and charter, all the meetings that were held, all of the use cases that were collected, all of the details to back up this proposal. And Scarlett, if we don't have any questions or comments, we will move on to the last section.
Nothing in the chat.
Okay, great. Okay, so we just went over the two CTDL proposals that I hope, even if some of it was a little technical, that what you understand is that a lot of thought, a lot of care, a lot of work, a lot of research, feedback and so forth goes into these proposals. And I want to thank all of you who participated with all of the process thus far, and please do continue to do so. Now we're going to talk about a new task group that's coming up. And Stuart has turned his camera on. Thank you, Stuart. He's going to give you a little overview of the newly formed Pathways Constraints task group.
Thank you, Jeannie. If you've been watching the CTDL's development over the last 3 years, since 2019, you'll know that we've integrated into the CTDL the capability to describe pathways. And what we are going to be doing with this new task group that'll be spun up in the beginning of next month and will meet for a couple of months is what we call constraints. And let me give you a little bit of history. In 2019, we formed a task group to develop a specification within the CTDL for pathways. That group, as I said, worked from 2019 to 2020, and we actually finalized a pathways specification, but reserved one piece of it for further development. And the work that we're going to be approaching now is to fill in that last piece. So since then, we have already been, as Jeannie noted, using this with a lot of data, so that we already have pathways in the registry. And now we're, in essence, ready to go and jump to that next piece. And what that next piece is basically the development of what I would call a constraints architecture or a constraints language for describing specific constraints on nodes in a pathway. Those nodes might, for example, be comprised of courses, and you want to be able to say that credit value is less than or equal to 3. In other words, they've got to be courses that have credit value of 3. So all sorts of constraints need to be expressed and show up in the data. And currently we can't accommodate those constraints. And I don't think Ginny, do I need to explain this diagram, or can we move on, or would you like me to explain it?
I mean, I don't think you have to really get into the diagram too much, other than the important thing is that with the CTDL, we are talking about representing information as human and machine readable data, and most importantly as linked data. And what we're doing is taking, Stuart, you like to often call them like posters. You know, I'm sure all of you are familiar, you've seen web pages, or you've been handed a flyer or something, maybe at a student job fair kind of event, where they're depicting the concepts of education and career pathways. But what we have been doing over the last, as Stuart said, I lose track of time, but at least 3 years now, spending a lot of time doing analysis of these kind of pictures and converting the concepts of them into the CTDL so they could be used by systems and applications and depicted with visuals of what they look like. And so this picture is just aimed at kind of giving that idea of what are the components of a pathway and how do they all link together.
And I would say a little bit more about it, that they also, what we found, and the original design and intention was that we be able to express pathways of various sorts. And by that, I mean various structures. So here we see a pathway that if you read it, you'll notice that the blue nodes on the far right and on the far left have origin and destination. Origin is where a student comes in or a learner comes into the pathway, and the destination is where they end up, the goal that they have set. This diagram also shows that that they're to get from the origin on the far right to the far left had alternate ways to get there. There were different ways to get there. So I like to liken these things to transit maps, you know, like the transit map of London or San Francisco. That you have an origin, you have a destination, you have multiple ways to get there. And what we wanted to be able to do was to express all of those. So we can do latticed pathways and lateral movement between pathways and so forth. So that's sort of what this diagram is, just giving you a hint of how it comes together. So again, the pathway constraints task group will be shaping up to do a couple of things. We're going to be looking for subject matter experts in kind of 2 areas, plus anybody who's interested in joining. Anybody who's interested in joining may, even though you may not consider yourself an SME of some sort. But we want subject matter experts in that create, make available, use pathways that in fact have these kinds of constraints attached to them. The one that I just gave, you know, the credit value of the courses have to be equal to or greater than 3. You might want to be able to say that this component in this large pathway actually appears in 2 or 3 places. But if you fulfill it by taking and let's imagine their course, if you take that course, it's only useful to satisfy 1 node in the pathway, even though it's an alternate that could be picked anywhere across the pathways. But people who encounter these have pathways that actually need these things. That's one type of SME that we're looking for. Another are technical people SMEs with some experience in expressing these kinds of constraints in a machine actionable way, because we want to, one, make the outcomes of the constraints human consumable, in other words, human readable, but at the same time, they can inform operations on systems down the road. So they can be used to define express constraints and then put into systems where a student tracking system where it says, well, you know, Mary Jane took this course here, she can't apply it over here to fulfill a different requirement because of the constraint. We want machines to be able to look at them, and we want the data to be smart enough to inform both humans and machines. And so there's people, that's the second category, people who have expertise in this kind of area, technical expertise in expressing these kinds of things. We have a pilot balloon. We always try to float a balloon, and I just put a link in the chat to a document that kind of outlines what constraints are and how we're defining constraints within the context of the work we're doing. So anyway,
thanks, Stuart.
it's gearing up. Yeah.
And the main thing with this task group is if you don't have to know all the ins and outs of the CTDL.
Yeah,
we have little lessons, and you'll emerge from this well-informed. What we really need are people who are subject matter experts, and you don't have to be a technical expert. We need the designers as well as the technical, and then that way we all work together to solve the problem. So please do join, and if you know anyone who would be interested, you can pass this on to them. We have a more the merrier attitude. Our task groups are open to anyone. You don't have to be a member or anything like that. We just want you to, actively participate, typically holding no more than 6 meetings. So let's get into the next steps. We only have about a minute left. Provide feedback on our proposals and join the task group. And our next steps is what we do is support a minimum of a 2-week comment period. We do get comments, we log everything. We're completely transparent in our process and how we go about it. And then basically what we have to start doing behind the scenes is preparing. We have to get ready to update our handbooks, our APIs, our publishing tools, the credential finder, all that kind of stuff. So that's what we're thinking about while you're providing your feedback. And again, feel free to contact us if you have any questions or feedback. Scarlett, anything else we should add in our final minute of this session?
No, I think you have that pretty well covered. Thank you all for joining us today. And as always, the recording of today's session and all of the resources and presentation we went over will be made available and sent to you. And as Jeannie mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at any time.
And thanks to all of you again for joining today. We truly appreciate your time and interest. Hoping to talk and see you soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.